Ever since I started reading Tales from the Pizzaplex in early 2023, I always assumed they were in the same timeline as the games. The first story I read was GGY, which was a clear security breach prequel, and then almost every story I read after that ended up creating a convoluted web of an overarching story, and by the time the book series ended, that story had no conclusion. But that was fine, the conclusion was obviously security breach. Except, Tales from the Pizzaplex isn't in the game timeline. Sure, if you summarize the Tales story The Mimic in one sentence, it'll sound basically the same as the backstory we get in Secret of the Mimic. Fiona dies, Edwin builds the Mimic, David dies in the street, and Edwin beats the Mimic, teaching it violence. But there are so many major details changed that we can't possibly look at them as the same story. I'll go deeper into the changes later on, but for now here are a few quick examples of what changes. Who founded the company, how Edwin and Fiona met and how they died, who commissioned the Jester and the Mycelium Men, and Edwin's personality and motives. An easy knee-jerk reaction to all of this would be to say that it's classic Scott miscommunication. He didn't tell Steel Wool anything when they made Security Breach, and he went months at a time without contacting Megacat Studios. But such an idea has no basis in reality. Scott is credited as one of the main writers for Secret of the Mimic, while past games just gave him a created by title. And if that's not enough, the game itself contains a reference to an event that happens in Tales but not in Secret of the Mimic. In the basement, there's a note where M1 has a false memory of there being complications when David was born. That's not an event that ever happens in the game lore, but Fiona did die giving birth to David in Tales. Therefore, we know with absolute certainty that Steel Wool did know the full events of the Mimic story, but they, and Scott, made the deliberate choice to not adhere to it. This leaves us with only two possibilities. Either Tales was never supposed to be canon, or it was canon at one point but was eventually shafted. I initially felt like completely dismissing the latter option, because it felt like a cop-out answer. I was right all along, but Scott changed the lore, just like MatPat with Dream Theory. But my goal has always been to find the intended answers, not to validate my own previous theories. So I think I can entertain both of the possibilities without being too swayed by confirmation bias. Let's start with the idea that Tales was never meant to be canon. Is there any evidence for Tales being non-canon from before Secret of the Mimic? Or rather, is there any valid evidence? I've seen lots of supposed inconsistencies pointed out over the years, but they were all results of the Pizzaplex being in an earlier state or someone just misunderstanding the story they read. Well, except for one thing. In the story Didophobia, we get a layout of Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals that doesn't quite match up with the one from Sister Location. But then again, it doesn't really make any sense within the story itself either, with all the twists and turns that should cut right into each other. We can't just look at times where something exists where it shouldn't, though. We also need to look for things that don't exist where they should. And there's one massive example of that, Vanny. 8 books, 24 stories, and not one instance where Vanny even gets so much as an indirect reference. That's pretty suspicious. Also, this is going into far more speculative territory, but it's possible that the story I started going down this path because of GGY wasn't even meant to be in Tales. When the book it was in was first announced in July 2022, it was described as having the storyteller, Bobby Dots Part 2, and the scrapped story Monster. It was only in September of that year that it was changed to have GGY instead. Could it be that Scott felt the need to rush in a new story to explain something Security Breach fumbled, and he replaced the story he deemed to be the worst one with it? Maybe. But Monster was scrapped a second time and replaced with Bleeding Heart, which has no lore relevance, so it could also be that GGY was always planned but the order was shuffled. I do personally think this idea has some weight to it, though. It's the only story in the entire book series that acknowledges the existence of Glitchtrap, which ends up being highly redundant because the Mimic already took over the Pizzaplex in the Storyteller. If this idea is correct, then GGY would be the one Tales story that's in the game timeline instead of the main Tales timeline, which would be weird, but not impossible. There is one last thing, but it requires looking all the way back to the announcement of Fazbear Frights, which Tales from the Pizzaplex is a sequel series to. Scott stated before release that Fazbear Frights was a collection of short horror stories that takes place in the FNAF universe. That sure makes it sound like it's in the game timeline, but then, in the very first Fazbear Frights story, we get this conversation between two characters that adds nothing to the plot itself. Once the movie was over, Dad said, "Well, that was pretty good, but not as good as the real version." "What do you mean, the real version?" Oswald said. "That was a real version." "Not really," Dad said. "I mean, it was set in the same universe as the real version, but it was kind of a cheap knockoff of the one that came out when I was a kid." They're pretty clearly talking about a reboot here, which makes the phrase "set in the same universe" really stick out. Could this be a way of telling us that Scott considers retellings of stories in new continuities to be the same universe? It's very possible. Ultimately, though, even if there hadn't been any proof from before Secret of the Mimic that the Tales books weren't canon, it wouldn't really matter. The burden of proof is on the claim that the answer isn't the same now as what it used to be. So, is there any solid evidence that Tales was ever canon? There are a couple of things I can think of. First, in Bobby Dots Part 1, the staff bots of Fazablast were changed from actual alien bots in early copies to regular staff bots in the final copy. This aligns with Security Breach's actual development. The bots of Fazablast were aliens in beta versions of the game, but were changed to normal ones in the final release. Why bother changing that in the book if it's not meant to be one-to-one with the game? Second, the interactive novel VIP, which released about a year ago, smoothed out the inconsistencies between the Pizzaplex as seen in Tales and the Pizzaplex as seen in Security Breach, by making it so the Security Breach map was a result of expansions. Why do that if this wasn't something that needed an explanation in the first place? Although, to be fair, there's a flaw in that logic, because Secret of the Mimic was well into development by the time VIP released. There's one more thing, but I've saved it for last because I want to take a deeper look at it. As the Tales epilogues were releasing, they seemed to be going out of their way to explain the origins of Burntrap, clearing up mistakes that Steel Wool made. If the books are separate from the games, why not just clear that up in Ruin? It came out while the books were being released, after all. The penultimate epilogue had all the pieces in place for the charred black mimic to become Burntrap, with him climbing into a human's body while they wore a costume, and someone being given the idea to trap him in a springlock suit. Obviously this was leading up to Burntrap's creation, right? Well, that's where this gets complicated. Instead of Burntrap being created, the Mimic crawled out of the costume with somehow no traces of human remains stuck to him, and then he got springlocked in a jester suit, which, when we saw it in an earlier story, had no indication of being a springlock suit. So, were the previous epilogues just baiting us? Were we misinterpreting them all along and we were never even supposed to make those connections? Or, and this might be a stretch, but could the plans have changed for the book's canonicity in between the writing of the last two epilogues? Sadly, I have no solid answer to give. Tales could have been tricking us. It could have never intended for us to make connections at all. Or it could have been canon at one point but then tossed aside. Only Scott himself can ever tell us for sure which option is true. And I don't think it's worth starting a new flame war over, since the result is the same no matter what. But I figured that after all this trouble I went through with these books, I may as well do a little thought experiment. If Tales was originally canon, then in that situation, why would each change from the original story have been made? To do this, we need to look through each change individually and think about what would have been different if it hadn't been made. Let's just go in the order that we learn about them. The first change is a no-brainer for them to make. In the original story, the warehouse was 5,000 square feet. That's like the size of the mansion at the top of the hill. If the entire game took place in a building of that size, it would suck. Any chase sequence would end in less than 10 seconds, and you'd be sneaking between the same couple of rooms for hours. Nobody would play a game like that. Next, we have Edwin and Fiona meeting at MCM. Originally, they met at college, but if they stuck with that origin story, then we wouldn't get to hear it. It's not like Edwin could just take recordings from their campus and store them around the manor. Well, I guess technically he could, but it would be needlessly confusing for players. Immediately after that, like literally one sentence later, we learned that MCM was originally owned by Edwin's dad. In the book, he founded the place himself right after college. Honestly, I can't think of any reason why this change would be made. Maybe so he wouldn't be super successful until after meeting Fiona? I really don't know. I found it to be one of the weirder changes, and when watching playthroughs I discovered that I wasn't the only one.
This is my dad's place. 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 This is my dad's place.
The one after that is a change I completely understand, because the original idea was frankly just dumb from a storytelling perspective. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, Edwin made dozens of animatronics exclusively for Fazbear Entertainment, including 2 jesters and the Mycelium Men. Why would Fazbear Entertainment need all these random characters back in the mid-1970s? All they had back then was Fredbear's Family Diner with 2 animatronics. In Secret of the Mimic, though, Edwin wasn't just working for Fazbear Entertainment. He had all sorts of clients, as well as original projects. The jester suits were made to promote his own product, a cereal with small inventions inside. And the Mycelium Men were a cartoon band that Edwin made costumes and toys for. An extension of this change was the Fazbear Project plotline. In Tales, Edwin was just making random characters for Fazbear Entertainment, which were noted as A Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. This implied they were already being mass-produced in the mid-70s, despite the first Freddy's location not opening until 1983. That's not just dumb, that's directly contradicting the established lore. And then there was the fact that Edwin in Tales had no knowledge of Henry or William's existence, but was rather consulted by a random Fazbear executive named Grant Sterling. It was a perfect opportunity to tie in old characters, but the story wasted it. But then, of course, Secret of the Mimic actually did take that opportunity, which I was incredibly happy about. Now Edwin wasn't just some random guy making random Freddy costumes. He was an active part of Fazbear's history and the creation of the original characters. Funny enough, this is something that was suggested in the Tales epilogues despite not being true in the Mimic story itself. The last major change is the only one that really left a bad taste in my mouth, and that's the drastic change in Edwin's characterization. I saved this one for the end because it's all over the place and thus hard to put into any sort of ordered list. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, he hated the idea of working with costume characters and only wanted to make serious creations. But he also had enough respect for entertainment workers to find the idea of AI-generated storytelling disgusting on a moral basis. In Secret of the Mimic, he's super into the whole wacky costume character thing. And as for AI-generated storytelling, well, I'll just let him speak for himself on that one.
If writers have you blocked, use an MCM story template. It writes itself. What about the talent? Well, we removed the talent.
Tales Edwin would take Game Edwin out back and shoot him in the head after hearing that. Then again, it's possible that Tales Edwin didn't have a distaste for AI storytelling until after his 30-year vacation following the events of the Mimic story, so I guess we can't say for sure that part is actually a change at all. But then there's the way Edwin acts towards his family. In the game, he's constantly dismissive of his wife and neglectful of his son for no reason.
That's great, honey, but you're missing the party. David's 2 years old. He won't remember a thing.
I know you're my lawyer and all, but there's no regulation that says I can't have it there, so just get off my back. Besides, David loves the new slide. It'll be fine.
Fiona, go get him. I left him out at the playground.
But in Tales, he was genuinely trying his best to be a good dad, even if he was really bad at it. Tales Edwin didn't just choose to not hire David a babysitter or build a fence to keep David away from the street. He didn't have the money for those things. I feel like this was an unfortunate consequence of making MCM a giant company. If Edwin is wealthy, the only way to have the same story beats is for him to be a terrible, idiotic person. It also changed his attitude towards AI replicas of people. In Tales, Edwin simply made the mimic as a friend for David to keep him busy, and that's the way it stays until David dies. But in the game, Edwin ends up encouraging M1 to mimic his dead wife and take her place raising David. This change just kinda makes me uncomfortable, which to be fair was probably the goal, but it left a giant hole in the story where David and Mimic's friendship used to be. There was a simple progression in the book. Mimic and David are friends. Mimic copies David. David dies. Mimic keeps copying David. Edwin gets mad and beats the Mimic. Now it's a lot more convoluted. M1 and David are friends, but M1 starts copying Fiona for some reason. Edwin encourages this. David dies. M1 misses David and encourages Edwin to build a copy of her that mimics David instead of Fiona. Edwin says no and builds M2 as something else, but I guess it ended up copying David anyway for some reason. Edwin gets mad and beats the Mimic. See how many more hoops we had to jump through? I guess maybe it could have been for the sake of added drama or something, but I'm not really sure. Hell, for all I know, it could have been a response to Matt Pett's Mrs. Afton wants to recreate her family theory. But don't forget, all of that was just a big thought experiment. We don't know if Tales was ever canon to begin with, and we probably never will. Still, I thought it was a fun one, and a good farewell to the Tales games theory. Even though I think the Mimic story did some things better than Secret of the Mimic, I can't say that I'm upset that the books aren't canon. If you've seen my ranking video, you'll know that I find 75% of the stories to be somewhere between mediocre and terrible. Although I find it ironic that the parallel theories were so close but got the idea backwards. The main two takes on Tales were A, they're canon, or B, the events are the same but the characters are different. But then, in reality, the characters were the same and the events were different. Well, I guess it's possible Andrew is an exception, but that's a theory for another day. And if you want to see it when that another day comes, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That is, if you're even still listening. I assume most people click off the video once it gets to the outro.